Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're visiting with Scott Marshal, author of Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life, brought to us by WND and WND Books. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on, Rabbi Eric.
Well, it's a delight to have you. Let me give a little bit of your background. You're the author of Restless Pilgrim. Your articles and interviews have appeared in ISIS and The Bridge, two long-running British publications dedicated to Bob Dylan. You're also the author of Bob Dylan's Unshakable Monotheism, a four-part series published by JewsWeek.com. You received your Bachelor of Science in Counseling Skills, your Master's in Journalism, and taught communications classes since 2003 at private and public colleges. You currently live in Toccoa, Georgia with your wife Amy, and you're working on a manuscript about Woody Allen's films. So you've had a journey of your own that seems to have been touched by not just Bob Dylan, but by Woody Allen and others. What is it that really was birthed in you that kind of made Scott Marshal go down this path?
Well, with Bob Dylan, I was 19 years old in 1986 when a good buddy of mine let me hear a record of his mother's, and it was Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits, the first volume from 1967. And maybe I had heard of Dylan's name on this early degree, and that's when it really started. And not too long afterward, I collected all of his. I was just absolutely intrigued and spellbound, like million people had asked what he in his music, and that started the journey for me. Just it was purely a musical. I'm not a musician, but I know what I like, and I just had never heard.
All right, we're going to read an excerpt right now while we try to get this connection cleared up. With the inside jacket, it says, "Never before has a book like this one delved into the spiritual quest of cultural icon Bob Dylan. Tracking an American original from his Jewish roots to his controversial embrace of Jesus to his enduring legacy as the composer of the Tempest album, Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life, delivers the story of a man in dogged pursuit of redemption." That's quite an analysis, quite a summary, Scott, of what you embarked upon in examining not just his music, but the spiritual aspects of the content, and even going back to his original statement where he made his acknowledgement that he believed that what he was doing was what God called him to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. He mentioned, I think that quote was from 2001, and later we would find out that was probably in the beginning stages of him writing his memoir, which was entitled Chronicles, which came out in 2004. But anyway, around that time he was vocalizing that he pretty much had accepted that his songwriting was a gift and it was his destiny. But yeah, in terms of the spiritual elements in Dylan's music, they have been there since day one, really since his first album, which did not sell that well. Actually, it was his second album, which some might know, contained "Blowing in the Wind" among others, and that's really when his name started to take off in terms of other people covering his songs. But yeah, from the very beginning, I mean, the line from "With God on Our Side," so that was just a couple years in terms of his songwriting. There was pretty telling questions in that in that song, about Judas and Jesus Christ. And this was a 21, 22-year-old kid who had written these lyrics, and it certainly was a far cry from the majority of the stuff that was out there on pop radio.
What's so interesting is he was the son of Jewish immigrants from Odessa, which is a part of the world my family is from. He grew up in a Jewish home, raised in traditional Judaism, embraced his Jewish identity. He was born with the given name of Robert Zimmerman. Not a lot of people know that. They just know him as Bob Dylan. But in this rich history, he was exposed at an early age to Hebrew, to his Jewish identity, having experienced his dedication, his covenant, the Brit Milah, which is the circumcision at the 8th day. He began to learn Hebrew conversationally, and so his identity as a young man was formatively Jewish, and in a traditional Jewish home, traditional Jewish environment. And yet we see him not through a spiritual lens. We see him through a classical lyricist, unique style, a sound that is his alone. It's either a sound you love and you weigh into the fullness of it. He's not an artist that I love his lyrics, I hate his voice, I love his voice, I don't like his lyrics. He's an entity. He is a man unto himself. And so as you began the book, you began to delve into his self-identification, is the word of the day, of he was just a man who saw the larger picture. He wasn't looking for labels and for titles and are you a Jew, are you a Christian, are you a Messianic, what are you? That was not his agenda, to become a spiritual icon or a well-known gospel writer or well-known lyricist for psalms and for church or synagogue music. He felt he had a calling and a gift from God, and it began to express itself naturally through him. And it sounds to me that this is, through your lens, what you began to see was a spiritual aspect. As you listened to the lyrics and you heard the references to you've got to serve somebody, you either serve the Lord or you serve the devil, or blowing in the wind, or many of the songs that we look back on, but you embarked on opening up the door to a view of Bob Dylan that exists nowhere else. There's plenty written about him. There's plenty written by him. But this really delves into the spiritual life of Bob Dylan. When you started this project, what was the real impetus, the real motivating factor, the vision you had in creating this work?
Well, originally it was really curiosity. I mentioned earlier just being blown away really by his music and his lyrics. And as time went on, I discovered that there were these so-called religious period between 79 and 81. And as I mentioned earlier, I had collected all his records, but at the time I would not say I was an atheist or agnostic, but I didn't particularly care one way or another about his spiritual or religious journey. And it wasn't until some years later, into the 90s, that when I had my own experience, faith experience, that I became more curious about that part of Dylan's life and his career. And so that set, in terms of curiosity, I began reading anything I could get my hands on, whether it was the biographies at the time, magazine or newspaper articles, because this was a few years before the advent of the internet. And so anyway, but I more or less discovered a narrative that said that Dylan had this Christian period or religious period, and that he had either renounced Jesus or renounced Christianity and had returned to Judaism, if it was discussed at all. And it's sometimes, I mean, and by the way, my book's not the first to address his religious or spiritual inclinations, but in terms of grappling with focusing just on his spiritual journey over these 5+ decades, along with original interviews. To my knowledge, it's one of a kind. And actually behind me, believe it or not, my wife's idea, but these are my Dylan books, and the first one was published in 1966. So that's when he had his motorcycle accident and then wound up not touring for about 6-7 years. And anyway, but behind me, I'm not exaggerating, I own over 200 books on Bob Dylan, and there's still at least 50 to 100 that I do not have, and those are just English books in English. And so yeah, it's pretty amazing. There's seriously a lot of interest and curiosity about the man, but in terms of books that just focus on his religious or spiritual journey, it's a pretty much a minority.
Well, what you're revealing is that you're tuning into his spiritual life paralleled you having your own personal faith experience, which then gave you the lens in which to be able to process and hear and see and discern that there was a message contained in the lyrics of his music. And the message was a spiritual message. It was a message about God. It was a message about man. It was a message about struggles. It was a message about what was contained in the Bible and the teachings of Jesus, but they weren't framed so specifically that they would be classified as gospel or as they were Bob Dylan. Mm-hmm. And so they were kind of enigmatic in themselves because they were part of who he was, and there didn't ever seem to be a separation. He's one of the few artists that what you see is what you get, what you hear is who he is, how he talks is how he sings, what he says is what he sings. There seems to be a continuity, a certain flow to the life of Bob Dylan, like a stream that is unusual, because when we look at other artists, we see ups and downs and ins and outs and different periods, but it's almost as if you're in his mind, you're in his body, you're in his spirit, and this is streams of consciousness of ideas that he's thinking, pondering, studying, contemplating, and then sharing and allowing us in to this journey that he's taking.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you an example. I thought of this earlier, like when I mentioned that motorcycle accident he had in 1966, and he didn't return to touring until 1974. Well, pretty much right in the middle of that, he was visiting Israel, and he was about 30 years old at the time, and I can't remember the exact context, but I do know that he was answering questions. Maybe it was at a university, maybe there were some members of the press. I don't remember the details, but I do know he was asked why he didn't proclaim being a Jew, and his response was, why should I have to proclaim something that should be so obvious, that it touches his art and his life in ways that he can't describe? And so again, if someone is wanting for him to, whether it was back then in 71, to come out and proclaim something, that is rather evident. And you know, as time went on, of course, with the album Slow Train Coming, that's when the world, you know, first saw that he had some experience with Jesus, and these songs that he wrote were a reflection of those. And what's interesting, I mean, that's his second album, Saved, after Slow Train Coming, after this experience he had, this very personal experience that he had, that he shared lyrically. the inside sleeve of the record Saved has a passage from Jeremiah, in it. And again, he talked at one of his so-called gospel concerts. He preceded a song with a rap about the origins of the Passover, and this was in the middle of the gospel tours, and so, some years later after this experience, when he returned to Israel, or actually it was the first time he played there in 1987, he included songs from Slow Train Comin' and Saved, in that concert. And even fast forward to, I think it was 2011, was one of the other times he played Israel, and sure enough, he actually opened up with the song from Slow Train Comin'. Of course, he plays many of his songs, and he goes through seasons. Sometimes it'll be top heavy with his compositions from the 60s, which are obviously mainly crowd favorites. And then, now he's been covering a lot of songs from the so-called Great American Songbook that Sinatra and others popularized, and he's singing more of his compositions from his more recent albums. But yeah, in terms of the spirituality, whether it's interviews or lyrics, it certainly has been something that's been consistent, even though Dylan's often touted as being incredibly inconsistent and unpredictable. There's some things about him that have been pretty steady, and his spiritual journey, I think, is a part of that, no doubt.
When you first discovered thematically that within the lyrics that you were now hearing after your spiritual awakening, as you're coming to faith, and you began to hear a little bit differently, did you contemplate how many hundreds of millions of people these words were being poured into, but because they weren't framed in a gospel setting, they weren't framed in a religious context, that they actually were reaching a broader, wider audience than any organized religious effort could ever even conceive of reaching?
Mm-hmm.
And that he became a true ambassador of heaven because of his almost, don't try to pin me down and label me, don't ask me what I am, you decide by who I am. I don't need to wear a sign. You look at me, if you think I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew. If you think I'm a believer in Jesus, I'm a believer in Jesus. If you listen to my lyrics, you know what I think. So he was not, from an interview perspective, the best guest that you could have on a talk show. He used the medium which God gave him to convey his message.
Right. I mean, from the beginning, I mean, he, in terms of that season of his life, he chose to not play any of his older songs for a 6-month period, between November 79 and May of 80. And people just didn't know what to think about. But what was interesting is one of the pastors, who was one of his friends and also later played on one of his albums some years later, this guy named Larry Myers, he was traveling with Dylan and the band in those early days of the tours of 79 and 80. And he actually encouraged Dylan to feel free to sing his older songs because he felt that these songs were, his gift, one of his gifts from God, and that they dealt with truth and etc. But Dylan actually wasn't certain about it himself, so he didn't follow this pastor's advice. Because later in an interview at the Los Angeles Times in November of 1980, he said he just wasn't sure for a season if those older songs of his were anti-God or not. And I've heard some Christians and some people who are not Christians just say, well, that's just evidence of how insecure he was and how unsure he was. But to me, I viewed it as, wow, this is some guy who in 1980 gives this interview. He's almost a 40-year-old man with a body of work, almost 20 years old, and he's being vulnerable enough, naked enough to talk to the Los Angeles Times about this experience of his and just what he was going through. And so anyway, but he began incorporating his older songs back into the set list, soon thereafter. But he certainly, Jacob Dylan, his youngest son, referenced this period years later in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of he was aware that it meant something to his dad, and that when his dad does anything, he goes fully underwater, I think was more or less what he said. And Dylan's been quoted along the same lines. When he gets involved with something, he gets way involved. And what's interesting is in 1983 with the album Infidels, there was a lot of talk about how Dylan was his Christian period ending. Was he was he no longer a religious man or whatever in terms of Christian beliefs? And anyway, the same guy that interviewed him back in 1980 when he shared a bit about what had happened to him publicly, Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times, he said Hilburn asked him, he goes, "Will you be playing any of these songs?" He goes, "Yeah, I'll be playing a few of those." He goes, "I don't disavow any of that." That was his quote. And he said, and I don't particularly regret I don't particularly regret telling people how to get their souls saved. And so, I mean, that's pretty blunt. It sounds, you could view that as arrogance. Some might view that as, but in terms of when he was asked about this, period of his life a few years later, that's what he had to say, at least in that moment. And so, but yeah, I mean, these songs, and the thing is with him, what's interesting is he was curious. It wasn't like all of a sudden he started investigating this so-called Christian thing in 1979. I mean, I uncovered some uncovered some stories where, dating back to 1970 and 1974, he was in conversations with people who took Jesus seriously in terms of they had this experience of faith, and Dylan was curious, like he's curious about a lot of things. And so this was kind of a long time coming in many ways, but he certainly had that formative years, and his Jewish roots. What my book attempts to grapple with is his Jewish roots and his experience with Jesus, which was very personal and very real to him. And and of course now it's been almost 2 decades since his Slow Train Coming album, but there's certainly a thread that you can see. And it's not I'll just say this, if someone were to say, hey, this guy's just projecting his own Christian beliefs upon this idol of his or something like that, I've heard that before. And what I would say to that is, like I said, I came into Dylan loving his music. I could care less about the religious component back then in my life. But like you said, it just so happened I had this own experience where Jesus became real to me, and then I was more curious about those songs that Dylan wrote, and just I wonder what's going on with him today, because I'd read all this stuff that seemed to act as though he just he had recovered from this religious hangover, this particularly Christian or Jesus thing or whatever it was. And so, but anyway, but I do think that 2 periods of his career, I don't think this is in dispute, that have caused the most controversy, and also, by the way, have produced some of his best music, were 65, 66, when he went, the so-called him going electric, and then the 79 and through 81 with the gospel tours. That those were 2 periods of time where he had some great band members surrounding him. He wrote some songs that he really believed in, and he went out there and sang them, and it was to mixed reviews. There were certainly some boos, not all boos. There were some people cheering, of course, but he got a lot of flack critically and certainly commercially, at least by the time Saved came out in 1980. So anyway, I think if someone is fair, you could reasonably conclude that Dylan still maintains this faith, which I call a monotheistic one, where he is, that's just him. He's rooted in that. I mean, he's drawn to spiritual songs. He said that in the last few years in an interview for AARP, and he said that he quoted Amazing Grace, and of course everyone, that song's just become, you could call that song just kind of generic to the culture at large, but he actually zeroed in and quoted a lyric and said that saved a wretch like me. which goes to, theologically to original sin. And, to someone like Dylan or anyone that's had that experience, that song would arguably mean something very different when you encountered it, and so, but Dylan, yeah, and by the way, I think Dylan's got a great sense of humor. I enjoy his songs that are so-called non-Christian songs. It's not like I just was curious about this period, and I just did a bunch of original interviews from people who crossed his path, and this is just another way to look at Bob Dylan, and there's certainly plenty that's been written about him.
Well, we are in this conversation with Scott Marshal, author of Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life, recently released by WND Books. And when we return, I want to get into some of the interviews, some of the original conversations that you had as we examine a man who is an icon in music and has been for over 40 years, and who has chronicled the same journey that every person that has a spiritual thought life goes through, with questioning and doubting, and he's kind of taken us transparently through those years and allowed us to go into that place that we go into privately. He actually used his music to almost therapeutically share his faith, his struggles, his questions, and then his confidence. And you've been able to uncover that the spiritual life of Bob Dylan, the evidence of it is his music, not in the pulpit and not in the context of religion. And this is that examination. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll get back with Scott Marshal talking about Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're visiting with Scott Marshal, author of a new book published by BP Books and distributed by WND Books, entitled Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life. And you can get this book by visiting the WND Superstore at WNDSuperstore.com. Scott, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Scott, you wrote this book by doing, of course, a historical analysis, but then you gathered a great deal of information through interviews with various people who shared their experiences with Bob Dylan and their insights. If you wouldn't mind picking one or two of those that you found to be the most eye-opening for you that you cover in the book that would be of interest to the audience.
Sure. In 1974, when Dylan had just returned to touring for the first time, basically in 8 years, there was this huge demand for a Dylan concert ticket, and I read in some Dylan biography, I believe it was something crazy, like 7% of the U.S. population had attempted through the lottery to get a Bob Dylan concert ticket, 1974. So anyway, so he's back to touring with the band, and he, in the middle of this tour, he, in Miami, Florida, pedals up on a 10-speed bike to what Rolling Stone magazine called a religious rally. Again, this was between concerts.
Right. And
he was going incognito, but I later discovered this was more like a Jesus People rally. And one of the speakers was this guy named Arthur Blessitt, Blessit.
Right.
And for those that don't know, because I didn't know, I just discovered there's this guy that carries this huge cross around. He's been all around the world. He's done it for decades. I mean, at first blush, it sounds absolutely crazy. But anyway, this guy came out of the Jesus People movement of the late 60s, early 70s in Southern California. I think his nickname was the Mod Minister of the Sunset Strip. But anyway, by 74, he was one of these speakers at this event that Dylan pedals up to on a 10-speed bike. He asked somebody if he can speak to Arthur Blessitt after the event, and sure enough, it's arranged. And I interviewed Arthur Blessitt in 2003, and he told me that he has a journal entry for it. He had a photograph of Dylan there with his 10-speed bike, and that Dylan asked him questions. He wanted to know what a real Jesus follower was like. and he asked him questions about his faith. And, so to me that was just pretty intriguing that, he was getting all this incredible attention returning to touring, and here he was on the side. He was somehow found out, and this was a brief little piece that was reported in Rolling Stone. But again, decades later, I tracked Blessed down and discovered what had happened, and that's one example. And then, in fact, I found out within a couple days of that, Dylan was in Atlanta, and that's when he first met Jimmy Carter, who then was the governor of Georgia.
Right.
And Jimmy Carter, a couple years ago, talked about how they went out in the garden of the governor's mansion, and Dylan was asking him questions about his faith, because, of course, at that point, it was well known, even though Carter was not president, that he was a man of faith, in particular Christian faith, that he had come to believe in Jesus. And so anyway, but according to Carter, they talked for about an hour and a half, and that was actually the start of a long friendship they've had over the decades. And but that was 5 years before Slow Train Coming even came out. So those were a couple anecdotes.
The people who commented on your cover I found to be quite interesting, because the top line statement comes from Alice Cooper,
Right.
who some of the world knows that Alice Cooper is a born-again Christian and lives a biblical worldview, biblical life, yet appears as Alice Cooper, the persona. And he says Bob's spirit is captured effectively. And here's someone that knew and knows Bob Dylan, and I'm sure that they have had discussions about faith, because Alice Cooper is vocal about his faith in almost any setting. Of course, Jimmy Carter, you alluded to, there's no shortage of material from which to learn. Noel Paul Stucker, Peter, Paul, and Mary writes, Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life, succeeds mightily in documenting Bobby Dylan Zimmerman's continuing and often misunderstood personal reconciliation of two faiths. But he did reconcile, and it became one to him. And it was the larger picture that he was presenting, was not a segregated picture of conversion as the world perceives, but as, and I hate to say completed, as if you're an incomplete if you're not, because that's where people go with that, but that he had access to the fullness of what he considered to be God. And he conveyed that through his lyrics. Who else along the way were you able to interview that shed some light on some areas in his spiritual walk? Maybe what one or two surprised you the most?
Well, I know it surprised me that he gave me an interview, but the late Jerry Wexler, the famous producer who produced Dylan's Slow Train Comin' and saved records of 1979 and 1980, he is a Jewish man. He passed away back in, I think it was 2008, but he gave me an interview, and I had no publisher at the time, but I attempted to interview him. He was incredibly generous with his time. I told him what I was up to, and I knew from the past, from reading interviews with Wexler in the past, that during these sessions where Dylan had just had this experience with Jesus, well, he tapped this famous producer, a fellow Jew, Jerry Wexler, who liked to call himself a Jewish atheist, because he was. He as he put it, he said, I'm a confirmed Jewish atheist, Bob. I'm 62 years old. Let's just make a record. I mean, that was one of his quotes that was out there in public. But I know I talked to him, and I had heard through somebody else that in the studio in Muscle Shoals sound studio in Alabama,
right,
that he and Wexler, they were talking about scriptures. Dylan and him were engaging in a little bit of banter back and forth about the scriptures, and that. But I was grateful for that interview. But like, there's some people who view that Dylan during this period became very intolerant. He was this and that. But if you really look closely, he employed this man who happened to be an atheist, to produce this record that is associated with his coming to Jesus, and also some old friends of Dylan's, he still hung out with, who were Jewish, who were not believers during this time frame. And so I think there's some misunderstanding, and there is a lyric or two people can point to, or some people point to, as evidence of intolerance, or when Dylan had, lost the plot or whatever during this period. But I just, I interviewed some people that, like the late Tim Drummond, who was Dylan's bass player during these gospel tours. He was not a believer. In fact, he noted to me, I interviewed him in 2001. He passed away in 2015, a couple years ago. But, he said that they would have some prayer before concerts, Dylan and his, most of the people from his band. And Tim Drummond said, what do y'all talk about in there? And Dylan said, well, come on in. And he said, no, I'm not going to. So anyway, he viewed himself as one of the outlaws, as he put it, because the Christian trip, I guess, wasn't his,
Right.
at the time. But in other words, it wasn't like Dylan just, the people he surrounded himself, it was an eclectic bunch, and there were some backup singers that he hired that were Christians, and who were connected with these shows, that sang with him on record as well as on tour. And I'll just say an incredible interview. A woman named Regina McCrary. In fact, she's the daughter of the late Sam McCrary of the Fairfield Four, a very famous gospel group. And Dylan hired her for these tours. And she told me a story. I tracked her down in the year 2000. This is some 20 years after the gospel tours.
Right.
And nobody had ever interviewed her. And she gave this incredible story about how Dylan, before he opened up this 2-week run of shows in San Francisco in November of '79, this would have been kicking off these gospel tours, that he felt something wasn't right. He wanted, according to Regina, and she knew he was for real about this, and she suggested, she just kind of was joking around and said, well, I'll tell this story. And she told this story she learned from her father, who was both this singer and minister. And it was a story about a woman in a train, and a woman whose son went off to war. And basically so Dylan heard her tell this story backstage a half hour before these historic shows were about to start. And Dylan just said right then and there, he went and got some other players in the band and brought him back and said, Regina, tell him that story. So she told the story again, and Dylan, according to her, said, that's what we're going to open the shows with. And so basically it was this story she told, and then it was already planned for these gospel singers, including Regina, to open up with a handful of songs actually before Dylan and the entire band came on. And so that was the very genesis, really, of the Slow Train tours. And so Regina McCrary, since been interviewed, is on a documentary about this period of Dylan's career. So that was another person that had some incredible stories to share about that time, because it was pretty intense time.
As a man who has devoted a great part of his life to studying Bob Dylan, reading about him, being inspired by him, and then being inspired to write this book, the audience, the person that you wrote this book to and for, was there some message that you wanted to get, the takeaway that you wanted them to have when they looked at the spiritual life of Bob Dylan? Was it your desire to frame it or to unframe it? What was the vision statement for this project?
Well, a little of both. I mean, it's framed in terms of it's a different angle in which to look at both Dylan's life and career. and it's an entirely valid one, by the way, because I didn't find out till years later that some minister who's since passed away, a guy named Burt Cartwright, he did some examination of Dylan's lyrics prior to Slow Train coming, the so-called Christian period, and then after that. And he basically found an equal mix of allusions to both the Hebrew scriptures and New Testament scriptures. And so, again, it's I think, a way, even if religion or spirituality is not your cup of tea, if you're a Dylan fan, it's a way to educate yourself about another way in which to look at Dylan. And certainly, in terms of his journey, it's not as cut and dry as, he became a Christian and therefore that was his religious period, because as you pointed out, he is a Jewish man. He has these deep Jewish roots, which, I don't know him personally, but I presume they are still significant to him. Just, it's as natural as breathing. And this whole intersection, I've heard it said that, you mentioned labeling earlier. I heard it said that, well, if somebody calls himself a Jewish Christian, that's ridiculous. That's like saying someone's a Democrat Republican, right? But if you really look at what Dylan has actually said, he's not called himself a Jewish Christian. But in terms of both his Jewish roots and his embrace of Jesus, and this very real experience that he publicly talked about, and he never renounced. And you look, and there's a thread, and I'm not talking about that goes back to the 80s. To this, present day, for example. I'll point this out. Come November this year, November of 2017, Dylan's official label, Sony Columbia, is releasing a box set of the gospel years, from concerts of that time as well as studio recordings. And so, the question, needs to be asked, I guess, if someone just adamantly thinks that they know that Dylan has renounced this Christian nonsense, then a reasonable question would be like, well, why would he allow, his official label, to release this? And, also, by the way, I mentioned Regina McCrary, who has connections to, with her father being with the Fairfield Four. Well, in 2003, a CD was released, an album entitled Gotta Serve Somebody, the Gospel Songs of Bob Dylan. And these traditional and contemporary gospel artists, mainly traditional gospel artists, covered his songs from Slow Train Coming and Saved. And Dylan was a part of that project, ultimately. He rewrote one of his Slow Train songs, and again, and so some people just might be curious about this part of Dylan's life, and they might happen to be Jewish and not believers in Jesus. Maybe they're Jewish and believers in Jesus. Maybe they are Christians and they're ignorant of, the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. Or maybe, because listen, I've heard people, seriously, I've heard atheists, who have acknowledged that this period, in terms of the gospel years, that this was one of in terms of his voice and the investment he had in these songs and these shows. And again, the band that he surrounded himself with, it's not, it's one man in a sense, because Dylan's very unique. But in many ways, it's the people around him as well. And, there's even atheists that will acknowledge that this music was incredible, and it'll be showcased officially, later this year. And like I said, there's a parallel with those mid-'60s shows that he did. But I just hope people take away that it's a significant part of Dylan's life and art, whether someone's aware of it or not. And I just set about to try to, go over the last 5 decades plus and just share some stories and some results, I did a ton of original interviews, so it's not just research documenting the time, but it's also a lot of voices that are in the book. And also, by the way, I'll just end with this, I include Dylan's voice. In other words, when he's spoken over the decades about matters of religion or faith or even his own faith, I try to honor that by including that at relevant points throughout the manuscript.
As a Jewish believer myself, my takeaway from this, and I hope that the message is loudly received, is that the spiritual life of Bob Dylan is a journey to truth and understanding without the construct or labeling that we traditionally use. That I was born a Jew, raised a Jew, and live as a Jew. He was born a Jew, lives as a Jew, and will die as a Jew. And our belief system and God's plan is a personal decision for each one of us. And he's expressed through his music what his personal decision is. He wasn't putting up for a vote, wasn't looking for input, wasn't asking for people to accept or reject. He was being the transparent musician that he was, saying, if this is on my heart and God gave me this gift, then I'm not to keep it to myself, I'm to share it. You do with what you want with it. Don't pull me into your narrative. I'm not doing this to become a part of your narrative. I'm not doing this to become a part of your system. I'm telling you my experiences as I work my life and live out my life spiritually and musically. And so he does not have to renounce or announce. He just is. And when you look at the character of the man, praying with a band member who has a problem, evidencing the attributes of a man who has a relationship with God, you wonder then, this God, who is this God he's talking about? And it should provoke you to examine yourself, not examine Bob Dylan. He takes you through your book. You take us on a journey with him through the spiritual life. We all have a spiritual life, a spiritual journey to walk out, and Bob Dylan did it through it. He did it publicly through his music and through who he was in that musical world that was filled with, at the time, drugs and a whole other set of trappings. But he remained faithful to his roots, his tradition, and that this was first and foremost a gift from God. And that's who he gives the credit to. Scott Marshal, thank you. Thank you for opening the door for people to know about the spiritual life of Bob Dylan. I strongly encourage you, if you're a Dylan fan or even wonder why this curly-headed guy that looks like John the Baptist seems to be out there in the world today still 40, 50 years later, and is still an icon, and his lyrics are still motivating and moving. It may be because it's touching a spiritual part of you that you're not aware of. So I thank you. I thank BP Books and WDND Books for sending you to us, and we thoroughly enjoyed having you here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Walker. I appreciate the time. It's an honor to speak with you, and thanks for the time.
Thank you. Go visit the WND Superstore and get your copy of Bob Dylan, A Spiritual Life, available now. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.